Just a little bit of background on myself. As I said, I was with the 1st Minnesota Regiment, volunteer infantry, doing active group. I was with them actively from about 1982 to, I think my last reenactment was 2002, which I barely survived as an older man. The reenactments are very strenuous. They camp out for, sometimes days in the rain, the cold, and eat the same type of food the Civil War soldiers did. But I did that for 20 years. That group at that time, we did a lot of kind of interesting things around the United States, a lot of battle reenactments, we did a lot of education programs. I spoke in Twin Cities schools for many years. We got involved in the movie industry, so we were in all the battle scenes in the North-South TV series, that some of you might remember. Patrick Swayze was one of the stars there. And other movies. The most interesting movie we were ever in was called Glory. That was Denzel Washington, was one of the Morgan Freeman. It's still a great movie. I think it's held up over the years. It's one of the really great Civil War movies ever made. But we did all the battle scenes in there too. Not only were we in the Union Army battle scenes, we switched uniforms at one point and we defended the Confederate fort. They would film us, so we got to be on both sides in that movie. It was kind of fun. And outside of that, we did, and they still do parades and historical events. You can contact them sometimes and get a person who will come out from there and get your school program, whatever. It's just a great organization. Again, it's just called the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, and they're online. Everything here on this table, or these 2 tables, are things that I wore while I wasn't a reenactor, with the exception of this hat and middle. So this stuff's all been used for years and years outside. And as I say, it's very authentic, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of how the typical soldier during the Civil War, including those from our own state here in Minnesota, how they lived. Minnesota had a very big role in the Civil War. There were, I believe, as I recall, 10 regiments that were sent off to the war. Could be wrong, could be 11, 10 or 11. The most famous, probably, group was called the 1st Minnesota. They were the ones who became so famous for their bravery at Gettysburg in 1863. They had some of the highest casualties of any regiment in the war, and a lot of people have heard of them. Company B of that regiment came from the Stillwater area. So Stillwater and the surrounding area here in Washington County was deeply involved in the Civil War. The other regiments that were in the war also saw a lot of combat, a lot of them in the western theater of the war rather than on the east. The 1st Minnesota was actually the only regiment, infantry regiment, that was actually in the eastern campaigns out of Gettysburg, Antietam, Moulin, all that. The other regiments fought out in the more western areas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, etc., etc. And they were in General Sherman's army, I think, most of them. There were some artillery groups, there were cavalry groups as well. I won't go into all of that. All of this stuff is very well documented. There's a whole bunch of great books on Minnesota and the Civil War that you can readily get at libraries or buy online or bookstores. There's a brand new one out I'm going to plug for an old friend of mine, Wayne Jorgensen. He's got a book out right now, a real big book with fabulous pictures in it. The title is They All Did Their Duty. I think I got that right. It's an expensive book, like he says himself, but it's a fabulous book with incredible pictures in it. And there's other books about Minnesota and Gettysburg that are out there, so a lot of information. Okay, enough of that. I'm just going to kind of walk through these items and talk about them. If you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand too as I go along here. And also, as I said, you're welcome afterwards to come up and look at these things closer. This is a real high-quality reproduction Civil War overcoat that would have been issued to the Union soldiers. A lot of the Confederates ended up with them too, because after battles they would go out and take them off from the dead bodies, or they would capture wagon trains once in a while. But the Confederates all wanted an overcoat if they had trouble getting them issued by their own government, they would take them off from they'd steal them, take them from the Union soldiers themselves. This one is extremely close to the original one that is on display. There's two some right now downtown. It's made out of wool. All the clothing that the Civil War soldiers would have worn would have been wool. They wore that all year round. Back in those days, they didn't have like summer uniforms. They had just one type of uniform. Wool pants, wool coats, flannel, wool type shirts. Some of them really heavy cotton, but mostly the undershirts would probably have maybe wool, even in those. There's a cotton undergarment down there I'll talk about. But all the outer clothing would have been wool. The reason they only had one type of clothing was that if you had to wear one type of clothing all year round, that's what you pick, because wool will keep you warmer in the winter, of course. In the summer, it also will breathe to a certain degree. If it gets wet, it'll cope with dampness, it will dry out, whatever. It's, relatively speaking, a pretty good thing if you can only wear one type of clothing, that's what you're going to pick. Back in those days, it's a little hard for us to imagine that you would have a soldier living in a climate where it's 80, 90, 100 degrees and high humidity day after day after day and still be wearing wool that whole time. It's a little hard for us to sort of get around that concept. But even civilians back in those days, the farmers in the fields, if you see the pictures, a lot of them wearing wool pants and long shirts. Lots of times they had vests on and everything else. And we all know pretty much how the ladies dressed back in the 1860s with the voluminous skirts and layer after layer of undergarments, whatever. They just wouldn't be caught dead back in those days wearing a t-shirt and shorts like us. And I think it's really more of a cultural thing. I never fully understood it myself, but people back in those days would cover themselves up with clothes. So soldiers were just sort of part of that. Just a note here on this coat, if you look at it closely, the buttons are actually original buttons from either the Civil War or very close, very soon thereafter. So those are actually real buttons that I put on here. I took off the rebos and put them on. Back when I was a reenactor in the 80s, you could buy a lot of that stuff still. You could find reproduction buttons for very little money back in those days, actually. Here, some of you may have sampled the fine cuisine that typical soldiers would have carried. Probably the most common food that a Civil War soldier, north or south, would have had would have been called hardtack. They were large crackers. They look almost like a saltine cracker. They're made out of flour, salt, and water. That's the ingredients. That would have been the main staple of any Civil War soldier during the duration of the war. That was the main food. For meat, they would have had salted pork. They would have had salted beef. There would have been sometimes that they would have had different kinds of vegetables, beans a lot probably, peas, that type of thing. But the reason that this was the main source of food was that lacking refrigeration in those days, they had to have some type of a food that it would not spoil. And these held up pretty well. They are I can't really hear it, but they are pretty hard. They earned their name hardtack. But they were pretty much impervious to moisture. That was the main thing. So when they would ship the food along with the armies, they would travel in wagons, they put them in boxes, and they would sit probably for days and days, sometimes for weeks, oftentimes for months, at some kind of a storage depot. And this type of food would hold up relatively well under those conditions, as opposed to a nice soft loaf of bread that had been just baked. So they were important, and the soldiers actually, they hated them at first. They got in the army, but later on they realized, well, that's not too bad. At least it doesn't taste too bad, and at least it is fairly nutritious. So that's all that they were aiming for. Salt was the only way they could preserve their food, so that was why the meat would be stored in brine in barrels, and that would travel in wagons as well. A lot of this food was so salty that when the soldiers would be issued it, they would have to soak it in water first just to make it a little more palatable. And you can imagine a lot of that meat was like, sitting around, and especially in the south, where it's 90 degrees day after day. It's sitting out in the open somewhere on a railroad track or off the track, whatever. And in a storage depot, the food was notoriously pretty bad lots of times, and you read a lot of accounts about it. One of the bad things with these hardtack crackers was that if the box would get open or split or whatever that they were being stored in, they were good targets for insects like weevils and that sort of thing. And there's endless stories of soldiers being issued their hardtack crackers. They'd issue them whatever, a dozen of them, whatever at a time. And when they would look at them, they would notice that they were moving. And those would often be weevils or some kind of insect that had gotten into them. And that was a big problem with a lot of the food that was sitting around too much. But actually, not only soldiers had it, a lot of our ancestors that came over on ships from the old country, they were eating these as well. They weren't just a military food. So a lot of us had ancestors that were well acquainted with it. They used to call them Davy bread, even in the older days, before the Civil War. They were on ships for the same reason. They held up pretty well. This is just a reproduction of what a Civil War plate would look like every soldier would have had, just like a pie tin. They weren't going to be carrying fine china out there. This is an original Civil War period fork, a little hard for you to see out there. 3 tines, that was real common. These go back to colonial days too, the 3 tines, sometimes even 2. But around the 1860s, this was extremely common, and the civilians would have the same type of utensils. All of our ancestors used this type of thing. The handle is made out of animal bone, sort of an interesting thing. They used animal bone for a lot of things: toothbrushes, buttons, forks, knives. It was an easy to manufacture sort of material, but durable. Spoons haven't really changed that much since the Civil War, or even colonial times, as you know. They haven't really changed that much. This is what a Civil War frying pan would look like. It's got a hand-wrought handle. The pan itself was actually machine-made. It's a reproduction, but it's really, really accurate. Canned food began to make its appearance big time during the Civil War era. Again, it was motivated by storage problems, having food that would not spoil. So along came some people that began to think, well, let's put it in cans. This is a reproduction label, an exact copy of an original that is, it says condensed milk, preserved, Borden's patent. You all heard of Borden's milk. And that patent was first issued in August 19 of 1856. So they were working on the stuff before the Civil War. When the Civil War came, that was a big impetus. Now, explorers would have used this kind of thing too. In fact, you probably heard that story. I can't remember the names, but the guys who were looking for the Northwest Passage up in the Arctic regions, they were eating out of everything they had was canned food. The bad news was that they would solder or lay the tops on these things with lead, as this one is. So they used lead solder to close their cans, and everybody was ingesting it. It actually killed those explorers up there in the Northwest. They found when they went to their well-preserved bodies, they found a huge level of lead in their systems. This is an original Civil War sword. It's dated 1863. This is what a non-commissioned officer would have worn or used. Sergeants is what would be a non-commissioned officer. Lieutenants, whatever, they would tend to buy their own swords. They'd be a lot fancier. But this is the kind of sword that, like Ad Marty from Stillwater, he would have issued one of these things. They're really almost more ceremonial in a way than they are really a deadly weapon. They're just not exactly the most practical type of fighting tool. I mean, they could be used that way, but I think it was almost more of a leftover from the older militaries. It's got a brass handle on it. The holder or scabbard is made out of leather. That's after reproduction. It looks very close to the original. Now, both armies used backpacks to carry their supplies in. The Confederates probably used them to a lesser degree, but they had a lot of them too. You had to have some way to carry things that you needed to survive. You needed some kind of shelter at night. You needed some kind of a blanket or maybe two if you were willing to put up with the extra weight. You had to have a place to store some extra clothing. At least an extra shirt, an extra pair of socks, an extra pair of underwear, and that would probably been about it. That's about all the soldiers had. They lived in their clothes big time back then, but they would have some kind of a change. So they had to have a way to carry it, so that was often done on their backs with these backpacks. This one is a really exact copy of the originals. I got an original one at home, but it's very brittle. The blanket is rolled up, it's put up on top here, roll blanket. It's got Company A embroidered on the center of it there, and it's also got the 1st Minnesota insignia. This was called a Corps badge. That's embroidered in there. It was for the 2nd Corps. That was just a military designation, the unit, the larger unit that they belonged to. The interesting thing to me about the backpacks were that they're actually made out of cotton. So if you look inside here, it's just a heavier cotton. It's kind of a canvas. And what they did was they painted the outside with what really amounted to a thick black paint or a tar, might be a better way to describe it. And that helped waterproof it. There was very few items back then that were waterproof at all. These guys in the wars, in the Civil War and the earlier wars, they just would have lived in the wet all the time. I mean, for me, one of the hardest parts to understand is just how people could stand it. True, they were mostly young and strong people, teenagers in their 20s largely. It was the typical soldier. There were people in their 30s and 40s, and even older, but mostly they were young, strong people, just like soldiers are now. But nonetheless, living outside the way they were, with really inadequate shelter most of the time, they got wet a lot. And in the South, in the summer, you can just, you know what it's like down there. It's hot, humid, and often very rainy. So it was a real problem just having anything being waterproof. And that would explain why this was probably the single, I think, most important thing the soldier could have had. This is a raincoat. Actually, it's a ground cloth, is what it was originally designed for. But they cut a hole in the middle of it, made it into a raincoat, so it served both purposes. But this was really one of the very few actually rubberized materials that a Civil War soldier would have had. And this was sort of state-of-the-art technology at the time. And then it was this particular one stamped. This is a reproduction, again, a very high-quality reproduction. This one stamped on the back, Goodyear. The Goodyear company got into rubberized material back then, and they were into it before, but again, the Civil War spurred that technology on big time. And they actually did make a waterproof ground cover and or raincoat like this. Now, every soldier, now the Union armies, they were issued these things. And not always. There was shortages, not everybody got it, but ideally, every soldier in the Union Army would have gotten one of these. And a Confederate would have gotten one after every single battle that they won, for sure. And anytime they could raid a supply line, they were going to get these raincoats themselves. So pretty much, I think every Civil War soldier was going to have one of these things. And that would be carried in a backpack. But that is really the only rubberized thing that they had. So painting the cotton was sort of a supplement to that. These are reproduction Civil War shoes. They're pretty accurate. The original Civil War shoes would have been leather completely, the bottoms. They didn't have synthetic materials, of course, back then, so the soles would have been made out of leather. The heels would have been just made in layers to build up the heel out of pieces of leather. The bottoms of the shoes, most of them, I think during the Civil War, at least at the beginning, the soles were put on little wooden pegs. They would have to drill holes all the way around the outside perimeter, and then drive these little wooden pegs down into them, and that's how they would pass the upper part of the shoe. Now, heavy-duty machine sewing came in to a lot of use back then, so a lot of shoes were actually sewn with machines on the bottom too. This is my third pair I had as a reenactor. I wore out the first two pair. If you do any walking at all, serious walking or marching, and you're carrying all this equipment, your shoes will not last long at all, especially on the kind of roads that they had during the Civil War. Soldiers would wear out a pair of shoes easily in a few weeks or a couple of months, whatever, depending on how far they were marching. So that was a really big problem back then, was keeping soldiers in decent shoes. There's all kinds of horror stories in the literature about men wearing shoes that had holes in the bottom. There are trails of blood along the roads where they had marched because their shoes were worn out. The shoes would chafe their ankles. In the movie Glory, it came out about 23 years ago now. There's a little segment in there where they talk about shoes, and it shows the new 1st Black Regiment to be enlisted in the Civil War being issued shoes, and they're wearing these things, and they've all got bloody ankles, and their feet are so sore they can hardly walk. That happened all the time. The shoes were stiff. They were, as far as sizing, good luck. Hopefully you got something that was pretty close to what you needed. But the Army, many Army shoes back in those days weren't even made in left and rights. They were just both made identical, just kind of a long, straight shape to them, and that's what they wore. And if you were lucky and maybe got them wet a few times, they would form to your feet, and then you'd be in better shape until they wore out in a few weeks, and then you were back when you started again with a stiff pair of shoes. A lot of Confederates would have been happy to have any kind of shoes. They had a real problem supplying their armies. And again, after the battles, if you've seen pictures of the grotesque pictures of the corpses on battlefields, lots of times there's no shoes on those men's feet. And that's not by accident. That's because the opposing army, or maybe even their own army, who was suffering shortages, had gone out and taken their shoes. That happened all the time. Any kind of equipment that was left on the battlefield that was needed by somebody else was going to be picked up. Another kind of a grotesque, I guess, factoid, but if you look at some of the old Civil War pictures of battlefields with the dead bodies on them, you'll notice that the pockets, their pockets on their pants are pulled out. You can just see that people have gone through and searched their pockets. It's a very common thing. It's something you won't notice unless you really think about it, but afterwards, the shortage of supplies in both armies often was a big deal, and part of the barbaric nature of any war, but the Civil War had certainly some particularly barbaric aspects to it. This hat is a real good quality reproduction of what was called a dress hat. It was more formal than the simpler forage hat and more common one that's down there at the end of the table with the big bow on top. But some units were issued these as their regular hat. The cavalry also wore a hat that looked like that, and the artillery did as well. They had different colored hat bands, and they had different insignia on them. Like there was a regiment from Wisconsin, the 8th Wisconsin, I believe, they wore these hats through the whole war. Some of the regular Army units, this was their regular issue hat as well. It's always been a little puzzling to me that they didn't use more of those because they actually gave you some protection from the sun, and they were pretty good rain protection, relatively speaking, as opposed to the far more common forage hat that we usually think about as a Civil War hat. I mean, this thing, all it does is cover the top of your head. You get a little bit of protection from the sun with it, but not a whole lot. But that was the more common hat. It was cheaper to make. This is an original Civil War musket. It's dated 1862. It's a little Actually, it's not all that heavy. It weighs about the same as an M1 rifle. It's about 10 pounds. These were single shot muzzle loaders. The bullet and the powder had been put down this end and loaded. Civil War cartridges. That's not supposed to come out. There's a swell at the end here of this one. It's supposed to keep that in. That's how that works, but this one is a little worn out. Civil War cartridges look like this. They were made out of paper. I said, usually surprises people that aren't real interested or not knowledgeable about old firearms. But they would put a bullet and a gunpowder inside a little paper tube so they would be in one package. It was just more convenient. So you would have everything you needed there. That would be equivalent to a brass cartridge today. In order to fire with a musket, soldiers would put the thing in their mouth and tear off the end. Technically, to be in the Civil War infantry, you were supposed to have 2 front teeth. That was in the regulations, and that's why. You were supposed to be able to put those cartridges in your mouth and tear them off. They would then dump the gunpowder down this end, and then work the bullet either out of the paper or put the paper with the bullet in on top of that powder, and then they would ram that down with this long rod here on the end. You see that at the bottom down here, next to what was called a hammer. A small brass exploding cap would then have to be placed on this little protrudence here. When the trigger was pulled, it would fall, and it would set off that exploding cap. I've got some of those brass caps up here if you want to see what they look like. 2 little tiny things that look like a little brass hat. And that's how each shot would have to be fired. A good soldier with some experience could fire about 3 times a minute. 10,000 people shooting at you, that's a lot. The bullets that were used during the Civil War are pretty much the same that were used in the American Revolution and wars all the way back into the 1500s. They really didn't change much. But they were typically 50 caliber, 58 caliber like this one. And I've got a couple up here that are 69 caliber bullets. It's pretty big. That's what they were shooting at each other with, usually at fairly close range, usually within 50, 75 yards. These guys were fighting battles. The end of some of the bullets were round. They were put in guns that did not have rifling. They were called smoothbores. They were far less accurate because it was like shooting a little, well, it's like comparing a basketball and a football. If you take a basketball and throw it, it's a little harder to throw and a little more clumsy, but if you take a football that's spiraling as perfectly as it goes through the air and it's pointed on the end, you can really throw that quite a ways. That's how these more advanced bullets were in the Civil War. They were conical, pointed on the end, and they would spin as they went through the air. And they were hollow at the bottom, so when they hit something, they would expand. And so that by the time this thing would hit somebody, it would be about the size of a 50-cent piece, or a quarter, whatever it would be. Very deadly, terrible weapons at close range. And these muskets were, people oftentimes look at a Civil War musket or a Revolutionary War musket for that matter and say, boy, is that ever technology? But these things were extremely deadly, and they were deadly at 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, whatever. They were still really deadly weapons. So crude as they look, they were still really bad news, especially up close. Soldiers would carry their ammunition in a leather pouch that would be suspended at their side over their shoulder. It's got a U.S. plate on the outside for decoration, but also to help close the flap. There's a little extra weight there that kind of helps to close it. Inside, there are the paper cartridges. I've got some fakes in there. The problem with the paper cartridges is if you get it wet, it isn't any good anymore. So they had to beware of rain and any kind of moisture. The leather would help to keep the water out. There's also tin liners inside the cartridge box that would help to keep water out. You're all going to look at those closer later. This is what a typical Civil War underwear would look like, a pair. They wore long legs. Again, they had something against anything that were shorts. They just didn't like that. They would tie the legs at the bottom with those little laces down there. And there's bowline buttons on the front. And they had shirts that looked very much like this as well, same material. Now this is cotton, a little more comfortable. There's an absolutely fabulous complete suit down at the History Center in St. Paul that is made out of this type of material, and it was made by a prisoner from Minnesota who was in living prison in Richmond, Virginia. And he handmade the whole outfit. That thing still survived. That piece of clothing down there, to me, is worth the trip to St. Paul just to see. It's really an extraordinary thing. And he must have been a tailor, because he sure did a good job on that. Without patterns, or I have no idea how he made it. He made an entire suit. Again, this is a typical Civil War Union Army hat. Confederates had them very similar to that. They would have been usually a different color. Not always. Some Confederate uniforms were blue, especially at the beginning of the war. Some Northern Army units had gray uniforms. There was a company here from Minnesota. Someone would have to remind me if it was Winona. I can't recall exactly, but they had gray uniforms that they went off to war with, which got them in some trouble at the Battle of Bull Run. When the first Minnesota went off to war, actually they didn't even have uniforms issued to them by the federal government. It's interesting because they were the first unit to actually sign up the first Minnesota. It just so happened that Governor Ramsey was in Washington when the war started, and he had connections there and got Minnesota signed up very first to send troops. But when they went off the Battle of Bull Run, they didn't actually have federal blue Army uniforms. Many of them were wearing red shirts that they got at lumber trade goods type stores with black pants, and they had black hats. A lot of their hats did look like that. One there in the middle, except they didn't have all the insignia on it, just a plain black hat. But that's what they wore at the Battle of Bull Run. They got the blue uniforms, regulation uniforms afterwards. This belt up here with the buckle on, that's what they used to carry the bayonets in that they would put on the end of their muskets. And the exploding caps I mentioned to you earlier were kept in this little tiny box here, leather box. This is what a Civil War bayonet would have looked like. They were made so they would fit over the end of the barrel. They would fit over the sight. And then you would turn them, and then you would lock them on this little ring up here so they wouldn't fall off. And basically what you get when you put a bayonet on a musket, you get a spear. They were supposedly used for close combat. When you really get down to reading about Civil War battles, there weren't really all that many fights where they got that close to one another. There certainly was hand-to-hand combat, of course, throughout the war, but it wasn't really widespread. And it's because the muskets were so deadly, you usually didn't get that close to one another. And when you read about bayonets, more often you'll hear them being used as candlestick holders. Or they were great for frying meat, stick that in the meat, the pork or whatever, roast it over the fire. And you'll hear guys after the war joking that, well, I never really used the bayonet to fight with, but boy, it was great for frying meat, you know. So, again, it was just sort of a sign of the times that that type of weapon was getting more obsolete because the muskets themselves were so deadly. There's all kinds of little artifacts up here. I'm not going to talk about all of them. You can come up later and look at them. That would have been carried by typical soldiers. Every soldier, north or south, would have had one of these things on. It's called a haversack. It's just a little carrying bag, and that would be for all of their personal hygiene items, anything that they would use for preparing food. They would have carried their hardtack crackers there, their meat, whatever, in here. Any convenience of any sort, like that they wanted to have a meter in their shaving kit. This is a repro, but a very accurate reproduction Civil War mirror. But anything at all that they wanted for their own personal comfort or survival, they had to go in this little bag. So they had to limit it and choose carefully what was in there. But probably every soldier would have had, besides his food, he probably had some kind of a little sewing kit. This is an example of one. They call them housewives. There's extra cloth in there, there's extra buttons, there's a little scissors, there's this cloth, whatever. Very typical thing. These were, I think as late as the Korean War, I think guys were still calling these things housewives. They had little sewing kits with them. This is a little bag that was cut out of a raincoat, like I showed you earlier, a damaged one, and then made into a bag, which would have given the soldiers a little tiny area that would be free from water, relatively speaking. A lot of soldiers carried these little combs. This is made out of animal bone. A lot of civilians had these too. I mean, I think every household practically in the country would have had these. It wasn't so much that they were worried about combing their hair looking presentable, but they were good for getting rid of nasty insects in their hair and beards. That's really what these were about. And probably everybody would have had one of those, or wish they had one. Got an example of a Civil War pencil in here, nothing too dramatic about that. Looks pretty much like the pencils we have now, except there's no paint on it, and they didn't have erasers on the end, anything like that. Here's a little tin container that says on the top, lucifers, self-oxidizing and to be kept dry. Lucifers were matches. That was what they called them when they first came out. They are pretty much like the ones we have now. Probably really struck on a rock. I don't think most soldiers would have had something like that. That would be a little bit fancy for most of them. But they could be purchased from vendors who would have traveled along with the armies. A lot of things could have been purchased from vendors, like that Borden's milk over there, that can of condensed milk. That would not have been issued to the soldiers by the army. They would have had to buy that on their own with their own money, and they would have been purchased at vendors they used to call sutlers. They traveled along with their wagons. This went back hundreds and hundreds of years before the Civil War. Anywhere there's a war, anywhere there's an army, there's money to be made, and there would have been people selling all kinds of goods for the soldiers' comfort. One of those things also would have been tooth powder. There's a little reproduction here. This is an exact copy, photographed off from the original bottle. I seriously doubt a lot of soldiers brushed their teeth for the 2-3 years they were in the army, though. This is a Civil War style toothbrush. It's made out of animal bone, and the bristles are made out of horsehair. Again, a very common type of material for small items, bone. This is an original Civil War canteen made out of metal. It's got concentric circles around it. This was supposedly to make it stronger. And they found out later they really didn't make that much difference, so they went back to having the smooth side. They call them canteens. Like this one. This is just no, this one does have the circles in it, I'm sorry. This is a canteen that has an original cloth cover on them. The regular issue canteens did have cloth covers on them. I've heard different theories. I'm sure there's people who know more about this than I do. I've heard that it would protect the clothing from the metal, and it would also help to keep the water cooler a little bit longer inside than just a bare metal canteen. I really don't know what the real story on that is. You can see this is, all I was a reenactor that used this thing. You can see how that thing rubbing against my hip for years, rubbed practically through the cloth on the back. This is what a Civil War cup would look like, made out of metal. Again, these are the same thing that the people back on the farm would have had. But every soldier had to have one of these just to live. They would boil water in here, boil up food, make their coffee. Coffee was a real big deal in the Civil War. Any account you'll read of soldiers out in the field, they loved their coffee. It's true of every war. It's true of most of us in the morning anyway, just at home. Coffee was a really important and much appreciated item. And oddly enough, it seems like at least in the North, coffee was regularly issued. It's like that somehow didn't make it out to a lot of the guys. The Confederates had a lot more trouble getting coffee, but they would come up with all kinds of homemade concoctions, chicory, I don't know what those, peas or wheat or whatever it is. But they made their own not so good types of coffee too. Anything hot and wet would be nice to have when you were out there living outside. These are reproduction pipes. A lot of people, of course, smoked pipes. A lot of people chewed tobacco. The armies were just saturated with tobacco, both north and south. And I think probably a typical Civil War soldier probably had black teeth and missing a lot of them. Besides being hard life with poor nutrition, everybody was, just about everybody was indulging in tobacco products. On the back of this raincoat, there's a checkerboard or chessboard drawn on there too. You'll see this in some of the originals. It's just another way of having a portable game board with you, serving to conserve space. That was the main idea. Okay, and I think I've pretty much covered most of this stuff. You can look at some of the small things if you want to afterwards. Are there any questions before we adjourn?
I just wanted to tell you, I got this book. I was wondering if you ever saw it anywhere. It's called Hardtack and Coffee.
He's asking if he's got a book called Hardtack and Coffee. It's one of the really great classics of the Civil War, written by a guy that was there in the Union Army. And if you ever want to read about the typical life of a Civil War soldier, I would say that's one of the very best books of all to read.
Is it worth anything? Is it worth anything?
Well, original one, yeah. Original, if it's an original copy, you know, from, I'm not sure when was that published, 65 or 66 or something.
This one's over 100 years old. It's back then.
Now, that could be a valuable book that's in good shape, you know, a couple $100 probably. They've reproduced it an awful lot. That's the bad news. There's a lot of I've got his second book at home myself. Any other questions? Yeah.
What proportion of the Union Army was volunteers versus regulars?
Okay, he's going to stump me there. He's asking how many in the Union Army, how many were regular Army people and how many were volunteers. And there might be someone here that knows better than I. It seems to me that when the war started in 1861, the regular army had like less than 10,000 people in it, I think.
I'm sure the answer is very...
So it would have been relatively small. I can't even tell you anymore. I used to know some of this stuff, but I forgot. I think there were about 2.5 million men maybe in the Union Army during the course of the war. But it was pretty much a volunteer army back in those days, north and south. Yeah, most of the people that were in the Civil War were, you know, the vast majority had been on a farm, north and south. They were on a farm somewhere, or were tradesmen, or had been sailors, or whatever, young men. Most of them had never imagined what a war would be like, and of course, they all thought it was going to end in 3 or 4 months when they signed up initially. Just thought it was going to be a short war, they're going to win, it'll all be over. Of course, it ended up being one of the most terrible, brutal 4-year events in the history of the United States. In the end, there were about 630,000 dead, countless millions of guys who were permanently disabled from all kinds of causes. Most people died from disease during the war, far more than died in battle because of the primitive conditions that they lived in and living outdoors all the time. Yeah.
How many rounds of ammunition would be typical for an individual to be carrying into battle?
right before, he's asking how many rounds of ammunition they would issue before battle. Typically, they would probably issue at least 40, oftentimes 60, often 80. The cartridge box itself would only hold 40. It would come in packs of 10 like this, wrapped in paper. There's 10 actual cartridges in here, pretty heavy. They could get 4 of them in here, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. This tin liner. The other they'd stuff in their pockets. And they're really pretty heavy, and if the battle, if it was raining or whatever, you would have, in that case, you have these things stuck in your pocket with paper wrappers on them, paper cartridges, and the rain's coming down and running through the mud. You know, it would have been probably kind of a touchy little thing for those ones that were not inside your cartridge box.
I have a question. After a battle where there was a loss of life, how long did it take for families to get notified that their loved one died in battle?
Okay, she's just asking after a battle, given the communications at the time, how often or how long would it take for people to be notified that their loved ones were either wounded or missing or dead, whatever. Well, I can't pretend to be an expert on that, but you know, just from the different things I've read over the years, people, I think, typically wouldn't learn that their loved one was gone for weeks and weeks at least. That would be more typical. They would, some cases after some of the battles, they would get casualty lists out, they'd be printed in the paper, I suppose within days, but I think many times this would turn into weeks. But beyond that, so many Civil War soldiers, they didn't wear, a few people wore little ID tags with their names on, but the Army didn't issue them. They went and bought them themselves and wore them. So the soldiers didn't have any kind of, you know, readily accessible ID except what would be in their pocket, a picture or their name on a Bible or something like that. So even identifying people after the battle was really a hit and miss thing back then. Lots of times people living in the really far rural parts of America back then was big time rural, most of it. People wouldn't hear for months and months, and a year later, they wouldn't know. Sometimes people, probably commonly, you know, their young man walked away, and that's the last they ever heard of him. That would have been a really common experience, I'm sure, for a lot of people. They would not have known what happened to them, and then they'd be counted as missing, and people just wouldn't know. So again, that's not a perfect answer, and I'm not an expert on it, but the communications back then and the record keeping was at a whole different level of what we live at today. And like in the Southern armies, I mean, if a person lived in Appalachia and went off to war, a young person, his people, if they're lucky, they're going to get a letter maybe every few months or whatever. But they wouldn't hear from these guys pretty much for about a year or two, or however long they were in the service, probably very typically. And if they were killed at the battle, they wouldn't know about it for, you know, for months and months, probably, or weeks or whatever, probably at least. Okay, well, thanks for coming and listening, and you're welcome to come up here and look at some of this stuff. And Carolyn baked some sample hardtack for you. I'm sure you're all going to want to get that while it's still there. You can see what that looks like. And you can look closer to some of these items, and if you have other questions, I'm glad to answer. Thanks a lot.